It was a typical Friday in the city, and the walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in on me. Work had been a slow, agonizing grind. My phone was eerily quiet, and I had absolutely no one to answer to for the next 48 hours. Looking at the piles of laundry and the flickering TV screen, I realized I couldn't handle another weekend in the hamster wheel. I needed air, silence, and a total escape from the grid. Without a second thought, I started throwing gear into the back of my truck. I wasn't packing like a responsible adult. I just grabbed whatever looked useful. A tent, a sleeping bag, a small hatchet I usually kept as a decoration, and a cooler filled with cheap beer and gas station snacks. I figured that whatever I forgot, I'd just handle on the fly, the classic American way of dealing with a spontaneous road trip into the unknown. By late afternoon, I was pointing the truck toward the highway, leaving the city lights behind. Once you get about 30 minutes past the last grocery store, it starts to feel like you're slipping right off the edge of the map. 2 hours in, the radio signals dissolved into nothing but static, and the scenery transformed into an endless blur of tree lines, cattle fences, and a vast dirt road that seemed to stretch into the empty sky. Eventually, I cut off the main road onto an old, unmarked service road that was nothing more than 2 deep ruts through the thick trees. I'd been down paths like this before on hunting trips and figured I'd just find a quiet pullout and call it a day. I wasn't looking to hike 10 miles into the wilderness. I just wanted a spot where nobody would bother me. However, I soon realized that I wasn't as alone as I had hoped. Deep in the woods, I began spotting strange pop-up camps tucked away from the main trail. They were makeshift setups, beat-up old tents, plastic folding tables, and tarps strung haphazardly between the pines. Smoking rings of rocks marked illegal fire pits, and I saw kids on bikes and dogs trotting off-leash. It looked like a community of weekend people, but there was an underlying sense of grit that felt a bit unsettling for a casual trip. Suddenly, an older man stepped right in front of my truck, forcing me to hit the brakes. He looked to be in his late 60s, with a face so sunburned and weathered it looked like a tackle box. He had long gray hair and a wide, toothy grin as I rolled down my window. He told me I was getting out of the area at the perfect time because everyone else was clearing out, and he offered to give me a secret spot for total quiet. For some reason, I listened to the old timer. He told me to keep going until I found a rusted cattle gate on the left. It wouldn't be locked, just chained. He instructed me to go through, promising a secluded pond where nobody would see me. He even specified that the east side of the pond had firm ground while the west was soft. He gave me a wink and said it was the perfect weekend to be alone. I thanked him and drove on. The gate was exactly where he said it would be, rusted and looming. I unhooked the chain, drove through, and made sure to latch it behind me. The trail narrowed significantly, with branches scraping against the sides of my truck as I pushed deeper into the silent forest. There was no wind, not even the sound of birds chirping. It was a heavy, unnatural silence that made the small pond reflecting the dead snags look almost like a mirror. I found a flat clearing by the water that looked like it had been used by campers before. There was an old stone fire ring, black with ancient ash, and a few logs dragged into place for seating. It was perfectly hidden, invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. I parked the truck, hauled my gear across a small gulch that blocked the vehicle's path, and set up my tent. The isolation felt perfect, almost too good to be true. I didn't waste any time getting a fire going before the sun dipped below the horizon. I cracked open a beer, cooked a simple dinner of hot dogs and chili, and hung my Bluetooth speaker from a branch. I played a true crime podcast, the voices of the hosts providing a strange sense of comfort in the deepening shadows. I told myself I'd only have a couple of beers, but time has a way of slipping away when you're the only person awake. By full dark, the fire had burned tall and hot, throwing flickering light high up into the ancient pines surrounding my tent. I could see my own breath in the cool night air, and the crackle of the logs was occasionally interrupted by strange, rhythmic noises from the thick brush. A faint shuffle here, a sudden snap of a branch there, and then a soft splash from the pond. I told myself it was just local wildlife, but the feeling of being watched never left my mind. Around 11, I finally stumbled into my small tent and crashed on top of my sleeping bag. I was so exhausted and tipsy that I didn't even bother killing the fire or turning off the true crime podcast still playing from the tree branch. I didn't even take off my heavy hoodie before falling into a deep, dreamless sleep within seconds. I felt safe in my little nylon fortress, completely unaware of the shadow approaching the unzipped flap of my tent. I awoke to a strange, heavy pressure on my sleeping bag that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Something warm and massive was pressing right up against my side, and I could hear the sound of slow, rhythmic breathing inches from my ear. My first thought was that a deer had wandered in, but then the smell hit me. It was a nauseating stench of wet rot, mildew, and human decay. I froze in terror, realizing that I was not alone in my own bed. Whoever was lying there was pressed thigh to thigh against me, their heat radiating through the fabric. I didn't stop to think. I just rolled hard and yanked at the zipper, diving out barefoot into the dirt. I sailed through the tent flap and scrambled toward the dying embers of the fire, my flashlight beam jerking wildly across the dark tree line. No one followed me out, and for a moment, the only sound was the sound of my own ragged, panicked breathing. I tried to convince myself it was just a vivid, drunken nightmare brought on by the podcast and the beer. I checked the immediate area with my flashlight, but the woods were silent and still. I figured a curious raccoon or a skunk had followed the scent of my chili dinner and crawled inside while I was passed out. It made sense in my exhausted state, so I eventually crawled back into the tent to wait for the morning light. No, I didn't sleep a wink. When morning finally broke, the world looked normal and bright again, with birds chirping and sunlight reflecting off the pond. I laughed at my own fear, thinking I'd overreacted to a bad dream. But as I went to relight the fire, I noticed something that turned my blood to ice. My Bluetooth speaker was no longer hanging in the tree. It was sitting neatly on the table. My firewood had been rearranged into a strange, deliberate geometric pattern on the ground. Then I looked toward the tree line and saw him standing perfectly motionless, watching me with dead gray eyes. At first, I thought it was the old man from the road, but this person looked much more feral and neglected. His beard was a matted mess, his hair was a filthy nest of twigs, and his clothes were nothing but strips of black garbage bags and torn rags tied together. He looked like a man who hadn't spoken to another living soul in many years. I called out to him, asking if he was okay, but he didn't even blink. He began to step forward with jerky, twitching movements, like a zombie from a low-budget horror movie. I shouted for him to stop, but he kept marching straight for me with that vacant, terrifying stare. Out of desperation, I snatched my hatchet from a stump and then ran to the truck to grab my pistol. I fired a single round into the dirt, and the echoing shot finally made him flinch. The man spat into the dirt and turned his back to me, standing frozen like a statue, as if waiting for a command. That was when I noticed the footprints in the dust. My entire campsite was covered in bare footprints with long strides and toes dug deep. He had been walking around me all night. I didn't wait any longer. I kept my gun trained on him while I backed away, tossing my gear into the truck piece by piece until the campsite was finally cleared. Before leaving, I checked the inside of my tent one last time. The smell of rot was overwhelming, and I saw dark human-shaped stains on the floor and handprints on my sleeping bag. The realization hit me like a physical blow. That psycho really had crawled into my tent and spooned me while I slept. I slammed the tailgate and drove off, seeing him in the mirror crouching low to the ground, picking through the dirt where I had been standing just moments before. By August, the bush had gone silent, and the air was thick with the scent of dry dust and brittle grass. The water holes had shrunk into muddy pits, ringed with the bones of animals that hadn't survived the harsh season. This was the time of year when everything starved, and predators became desperate. Hyenas were thin, and even the vultures stayed grounded to conserve energy. I had been guiding safaris for a decade, but I had never seen the land this lethal. Lions had started turning on livestock, and the local villagers were living in a state of constant fear. 2 weeks prior, a herdsman had been taken near a dry riverbed, and the radio chatter was filled with reports of missing dogs and goats. The prides were moving closer to the roads, shadowing vehicles and pacing the horizons with a terrifying persistence. They are usually lazy hunters, but when hunger takes over, they will kill anything that moves. That morning, my partner Rory and I drove out ahead of our client tour to scout the route toward the dry salt pans. We didn't speak much, both of us focused on the dangerous energy of the bush. A few miles out, we spotted 9 lions strung along a ridge. They weren't resting in the shade like they usually do. They were following our truck, tracking us with a cold, calculated focus that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up in warning. We reached our camp by sunset, knowing there were no clients or other guides nearby, just us and whatever lurked beyond the reach of our fire. The temperature dropped fast, hitting the mid-40s by midnight. Far off in the darkness, a lion roared, and another answered from the opposite direction. A chilling vocalization of a coordinated hunt. I told Roy to keep his rifle close and stay inside his tent, no matter what happened. The tracks we had seen at dusk were fresh and large. A big male's paw prints led straight toward our camp before veering off into the thick scrub. They were letting us know they were here and that they didn't care about our fire or our presence. I tried to reassure myself that they would keep to the high ground, but I was dead wrong. I woke up later that night to a rhythmic, living pressure against the thin canvas of my tent. It wasn't the weight of a person, but a massive breathing mass radiating heat through my thermal sleeping bag. Something rumbled through the fabric, a deep and steady sound like the idling of a large truck engine. As I processed the sensation, my blood turned to ice. A lion was lying directly against my tent, its purr vibrating through my very ribs. The air inside smelled musky, sweet, and coppery, the unmistakable scent of a predator. I didn't dare move a single muscle, fearing that any vibration would trigger a predatory response. From the next tent, I heard Rory whisper my name, his voice cracked and shaking with terror. I wanted to kill him for making a sound, especially when I felt a single claw extend from a massive pad and poke into the small of my back through the canvas. I felt like a piece of meat at the end of a fork, waiting for the inevitable strike in the dark. The lion's breathing hitched, and the massive weight finally shifted. The canvas groaned as the beast rose, towering over my tent and causing the poles to creak under the tension. I didn't need to see him to know he was standing right there, his paws level with my head, with only a thin sheet of fabric between us. My rifle was only 3 feet away, but it might as well have been across the entire continent. I was completely and utterly defenseless. The lion began to take long, wet inhalations, pulling the air straight out of the tent through the seams. His breath was hot, rank, and smelled of old blood. Then came the terrifying scrape of claws as he began to mark the ground just beyond my hip. I heard the sound of teeth grinding and a low, guttural groan that vibrated in the earth. I whispered a final "help me" to Rory, truly believing these would be the last words I ever spoke. Suddenly, a massive growl flattened everything outside, and the pride began to answer. Snarls erupted all around us, overlapping in different pitches, as the lions began to move through the camp. I heard one sprint past my tent, its heavy paws thudding on the ground, and its tail whipping against the canvas like a lash. Another beast hit our truck with a loud metallic clang, showing no fear of the large machine or the humans hiding inside. The pride was answering the call of the big male, and the sounds outside became completely primal and overwhelming. Snarls erupted between the tents with different pitches overlapping in a chaotic, terrifying chorus. I heard a heavy lioness sprint past my thin canvas wall, her powerful paws thudding against the dry earth and her tail whipping the fabric with a loud crack. Another lion hit our metal truck with a massive clang that echoed through the camp. In the morning, we would see the deep scratches on the vehicle, but in that moment, the sound was just another layer of horror. Rory screamed out in a sudden burst of fear, but he cut himself off after only a second. We both realized just how fatal our situation was. Any amount of noise or attention from us could mean an immediate and brutal death. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like my teeth were shaking in my skull from the sheer adrenaline. I could feel the ground beneath my sleeping bag vibrating with their heavy movements as they prowled between the tents. One lion roared so close to my head that it brought involuntary tears to my eyes from the sheer acoustic power. The sound wasn't just volume. It was a physical pressure that made my eardrums flex and ache. My small tent seemed to breathe with the force of the roar, bowing inward and then out like a living lung in a movie. Everything in my gut told me that I was about to die, and the feeling of helplessness was absolutely suffocating. Another lioness, identifiable by her lighter and faster steps, charged through the far side of our small camp. I heard her slam into our heavy plastic cooler, the lid popping open with a loud snap. Tin cans and plastic containers were scattered across the dirt as she raked her claws across the bin, searching for anything to eat. Rory made a near-fatal mistake by suddenly flicking on his headlamp in a moment of pure, unadulterated panic. The bright white beam cut through the thin wall of my tent, trembling as his hands shook. In that sharp slice of light, I saw a massive shadow pressed against the canvas. It was the head of the big male. His muzzle was pushing the fabric inward, making every whisker impression visible. His jaws were open, and I saw the silhouette of his teeth. The teeth were cutting across the fabric, only inches from my face, and I could swear I saw steam rising from where his hot breath hit the cold canvas. I stopped breathing entirely, my chest aching in a terrible way as I watched the predator investigate my scent. My own heartbeat became the only sound I could hear, a frantic drumming in my ears. He huffed again, a deep and irritated gust of air that flapped the open canvas against my cheek. Then, out in the dark beyond the camp, a lioness gave a short, sharp grunt, and the entire pride sprang into motion. The big male snarled in annoyance, his heavy tail thudding against the ground before he finally stepped back from my tent. The intense heat peeled away from the wall, and his terrifying outline finally vanished from my sight. He turned his massive body, brushing up against the entire length of the canvas as he moved away toward Rory. His coarse mane was rasping against the tent like heavy sandpaper, a sound that I will never forget for the rest of my life. I heard the solid thud of each paw as he walked slowly toward Rory's tent. I whispered, "Don't move, man," under my breath, hoping my partner could hear me. Rory's light went dark instantly, and the only sound left was the lions pacing around us, their tails whipping up dust in the freezing night air. There were at least 4 of them right next to us, maybe more lurking in the shadows further out. The big male froze again and made a deep, chesty snort, and the others went quiet instantly. I pictured them all crouched in the dark, eyes reflecting the starlight, their paws kneading the sand as they prepared to tear through our thin nylon protection. I imagined my own blood soaking into the dry desert sand as they fed on us. But as soon as the tension reached its peak, they just moved off into the darkness of the bush. It wasn't a panicked retreat, but a sudden and controlled burst of energy as the pride decided to head elsewhere. After a few agonizing seconds, we couldn't even hear their breathing or their footsteps anymore. The silence they left behind was almost worse than the noise, a heavy vacuum that felt charged with lingering danger. My whole body was now completely soaked in sweat, which turned freezing cold against my skin in the night air. I lay there wondering what the hell had just happened, and why we were still alive. After a long time, I heard Rory's voice whisper to me from the darkness, asking if I was still alive. I managed to croak out a yeah, and we both stayed awake until the sky finally started to lighten into a pale, dusty gold. By sunrise, our camp looked like it had survived a violent storm rather than a visit from a pride of lions. The fire pit was completely scattered, covered in massive paw prints that overlapped in every direction. The cooler lay tipped on its side, its lid torn off and the edges shredded by powerful teeth. My tent was sagging from where the male had leaned his full weight on it, the canvas slick with the greasy film and morning dew. Stepping outside into the cold morning air was a sobering experience that felt like a true victory over death. The horizon glowed with a beautiful, pale light, but Rory looked hollow and shaken as he emerged from his tent. Neither of us spoke for a long time as we surveyed the damage. The prints were everywhere, some of them bigger than dinner plates, and deep enough to hold dark shadows in the early morning sun. You could clearly see where the big male had roamed around the perimeter, and where the lionesses had prowled between our tents. Rory muttered that it wasn't just a visit. It was some kind of deliberate inspection. He was right. They could have easily taken us both if they had wanted to. I nodded in silent agreement as I reached for the radio. The device was lying in the dirt, hissing with static as I turned the dial with numb, shaking fingers. An urgent and breathless voice cut through the noise, reporting a confirmed fatality in Squan Village. An adult male had been attacked and killed during the night, and a livestock pen had been completely destroyed. The radio stated that 2 goats had been taken by a pride of at least 6 lions moving southwest away from us. I lowered the radio, and the bush went quiet again, but now it felt more alive and dangerous than ever. Rory looked at me and said that they were hunting, and we should consider ourselves incredibly lucky to be alive. I looked out across the open plain toward the ridge line where we had seen them earlier. On the other side of that ridge was the town where a man had died, a place where we often went for supplies. For whatever reason, the lions chose him over us that night, and I accepted that harsh reality without any questions. The plains out here are super unforgiving, and survival is often just a matter of moving on from temporary victories. The experience changed how I view the bush. Now, I never forget that the grass holds eyes we cannot see. Every time I set up a tent, I remember the feeling of that massive purr vibrating through my ribs. It's a permanent scar on my soul, a reminder that in the wild, we are always just guests on someone else's hunting ground. Looking back at the incident in the basin, I realized that the old man on the service road was more than just a local guide. His sunburned, tackle, box skin, and gray hair seemed to blend into the landscape itself. He had given me a spot where nobody would see me, and he was technically right. The basin was a place where modern society had long ago given up, leaving it to the toxic runoffs, old mine shafts, and the people who preferred the shadows. The ranger's later explanation about the federal property and the chemical dumping only added to the horror of what I had experienced. The locals who lived out there didn't follow the laws of the world outside. Meeting one of them was a charming experience I never want to repeat. The feral man in the garbage bag clothes wasn't just a drifter. He was a product of a place that had been forgotten by time and humanity alike. I often wonder how many other weekend people had been directed to that pond by the old man. Was he a scout for the feral dweller, or was he just a witness to the madness? The way the firewood was stacked and the speaker was moved suggested a level of curiosity that was almost childlike. Yet the act of crawling into a stranger's tent was purely predatory. It was a bizarre, twisted interaction that still haunts my dreams every Friday night. The psychological impact of being spooned by a stranger in the dark is something that never truly leaves you. Every time I feel a slight pressure on my back while sleeping, I bolt upright, expecting to smell wet rot and mildew. I've stopped going camping alone entirely, preferring the safety of locked doors and city lights. The American wilderness is beautiful, but it hides pockets of darkness that no campfire can truly push back or keep away. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in the Basin, a heavy, suffocating quiet that feels like the world is holding its breath. Even the birds seem to avoid the pond where I set up my camp. I realize now that the lack of wildlife was a warning I should have listened to. Nature knows when something is wrong, and the absence of life is often a sign that a different kind of inhabitant has claimed the territory as their own. When I fired that shot into the dirt, the way the man flinched, spat, and turned his back was the most unsettling part. He didn't run, he didn't fight. He just stood there, facing away like a broken machine, waiting for a reboot. It was as if he had lost the ability to process fear or aggression in a human way. He was just a shell, a hollowed-out remnant of a person living in a toxic wasteland where only the strongest or the strangest survive. Watching him crouch in the dirt in my rearview mirror as I drove away is an image burned into my mind. He was gathering up the small bits I'd left behind, treating them like precious artifacts. It made me wonder if he was trying to collect pieces of a life he could no longer lead. Or perhaps he was just a scavenger, picking through the remains of a weekend person who was lucky enough to escape with their life and their truck. The duality of these two experiences, the feral man and the lions, taught me that survival is often about luck as much as skill. In both cases, I was completely vulnerable, saved only by a sudden shift in the predator's interest or a lucky shot into the dirt. We like to think we are the masters of our environment, but out in the deep woods or the high grass of the bush, we are nothing more than potential prey in a world of sharp teeth. Rory and I still work together, but we don't talk about that night unless we've had a few drinks and the doors are locked. The radio report about the man in Squan Village is a constant ghost in our conversations. It could have been us, and we both know it. The greasy film left on my tent by the lion's mane was a physical mark of our mortality, a reminder that the wild is always watching and waiting for its next opportunity to strike. The basin and the safari are two sides of the same coin. One is a nightmare created by human neglect and toxic decay, the other a primal reality of the natural world. Both remind us that getting air and escaping the hamster wheel comes with a price. Sometimes that price is just a good scare, but other times it's a terrifying encounter that changes the way you look at the world every time the sun starts to set. I still keep that hatchet, but it's no longer just a decoration in my living room. It's a tool and a symbol of the night I had to defend my life against a shadow in the basin. My truck is always packed with more than just gas station food now, and I never go anywhere without a GPS and a way to defend myself. The spontaneous American way of traveling has been replaced by a cautious, calculated approach to any trip into the wild. If you ever find yourself on an old service road and a man with tackle box skin offers you a secret spot, keep driving. Some places are secret for a reason, and some ponds aren't meant for swimming or camping. Trust your instincts over the advice of strangers, and always remember that if a spot looks too perfect to be true, it probably belongs to someone else who doesn't want you there. Someone who might want to join you. In the end, we are all just trying to survive our own versions of the basin or the bush. Whether it's the pressure of a human body or the purr of a lion against your tent, the message is the same. Stay alert, stay prepared, and never take your safety for granted. The world is a beautiful place, but it has a very dark side that is always waiting just beyond the light of your campfire, ready to step into your world.